I would now like to invite Mr. Parolini, who's our next speaker. He leads the aviation decarbonization team at the World Economic Forum and oversees its net zero aviation activities, which include Airports of Tomorrow, First Movers Coalition Aviation, and Green Fuel Forward. He's earlier headed KPMG Sustainable Aviation Fuels division and headed the UK Department of Transport team responsible for building a UK sustainable aviation fuels industry. Mr. Parolini, I welcome you. You may please present your slide.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Can I check that you can see my screen correctly?
I can see you and I can hear you perfectly. All right.
Perfect. Give me 1 second because I still see Andreas' screen on my side.
No, I see.
Excellent.
Great.
Super. Thank you very much for the invitation and good to be here. I come from the World Economic Forum. Indeed, I lead the aviation team there, and my role is oversee all of the activities on sustainable aviation that we have. And the idea of today's presentation is to try to give you a little bit of a flavor of what some of the analysis, some of the reflections that are coming out of the sustainable aviation activity that we do are, and trying to take a little bit of a zoom out of some of the previous presentation, starting with a little bit of the global context, what's happening within the aviation space globally, some of the latest market developments, challenges, as well as potential solutions and levers that can scale sustainable aviation fuels, in particular biofuels as well, but also taking a little bit of an overview of some of the infrastructural challenges. We talked a lot about production, we talked a lot about fuel pathways, but there are some infrastructure barriers that can prevent also the scaling and the delivery of sustainable aviation fuels as well. So starting with a little bit of the bigger picture, I wanted to share some of the high-level themes and topics that came out of an exercise that we did with our C-suite community here at the World Economic Forum. We asked them to tell us what the priorities were for them when it comes to tackling sustainability and sustainable aviation this year. And as you can see, many of the topics and themes are related indeed to sustainable aviation fuels. We've already talked a little bit about the availability and cost of SAF through some of the previous presentations today. We have discussed a little bit the role of policy, but that was one of the key enablers and one of the key conditions needed to scale sustainable aviation fuels that emerged from that engagement with industry. But there were also reflections about how SAF fits with CORSIA, how CORSIA fits with wider policy in terms of carbon pricing, and how all of these different measures and interventions fit together when we look into driving sustainable aviation forward as well. We've already talked about the role of certification, but that was one important consideration that emerged by engaging through some of these stakeholders, looking very much into transparency, how to ensure that SAF is truly sustainable, in particular when we look at emerging markets, emerging regions, and emerging SAF pathways as well. On the right-hand side of the slide, and again, you can read a bit more about these in the report available online at the link on the slide, there were wider reflections that we shouldn't forget are also impacting the sustainable aviation and the sustainable aviation fuels market specifically. Whether it is geopolitics, obviously that is impacting, for example, the air traffic in terms of closures due to wars or some of the situations, but also in terms of feedstocks when it comes to biofuels. Wesley was talking about some of these feedstock trade flows earlier. These are very important in terms of ensuring that the supply of SAF is available, but can also be significantly affected by whatever geopolitical changes happen, by changes in trade regulations, in tariffs, and some of these themes that can impact the price of SAF, can impact the price of exporting some feedstocks. And we've already seen some changes in here over the last few months in China, in the US, and some of these markets as well. So these are just some of the high-level themes to set the scene. But moving into some of the SAF specific discussions, obviously we've already talked about SAF scaling. Some of the analysis that we did with Kearney over the last few months was very much looking into how that SAF sector is growing. And for sure, availability of SAF can remain a challenge when we look at the potential demand in the future. Definitely, that capacity has expanded over time. We've seen doubling the capacity in 2024 compared to 2023. And we're seeing some progress in terms of industry scaling the sector with expanded capacity that was announced and open over the last few months. Obviously, when we look at the core mandates, let's say what's already been established in legislation, there is perhaps some degree of reassurance that those can be met. But when we look at the whole demand, the whole potential demand from stakeholders that is out there, based on some of the voluntary commitments, based on some of the voluntary targets as well, this is where we need to see indeed that boost of capacity and where there are some challenges that we need to overcome. We've already talked about a little bit some of the technologies that are going to fill that capacity, the predominant reliance on HEFA, which is currently the cheapest pathway, but also the improvements in alcohol to jet that we've seen over the last few months and in the last year, as well as the potential to scale gasification and Fischer-Tropsch, as well as power to liquid, even though there are still some challenges associated with gasification, mostly in terms of the quality of the waste, which is the input into the process, but also some challenges with the cost of electricity for power to liquid, as well as more widely the availability of electricity, carbon, and all of the different components. So this is again a summary of some of the analysis that we did, trying to leverage some of the latest data points for some of these technologies, and trying to again capture directly from project developers what some of the capex investments associated with scaling SAF could look like. I wanted to come back to one point about capacity, because I mentioned indeed that there is a risk that that capacity will not be sufficient to meet the demand. But obviously that is reliant on how strong that demand signal is. We have seen the mandates indeed that are going to firm up a little bit that demand. We're seeing ambitious commitments from airlines, from different carriers, as well as from some of the Scope 3 buyers, which are looking into purchasing SAF credits. Obviously, if that demand isn't particularly strong, or if some of these organizations don't necessarily follow up to some of these voluntary commitments, that demand signal is going to be weakened, and that can affect indeed the scalability of SAF. Strong offtakes are needed, long-term offtakes are needed with some type of price structures like take or pay, or some of these specific instruments that can indeed scale the SAF sector, and the demand is really needed to drive the supply. Perhaps there is a lot of conversation about the demand and supply chicken and egg, and obviously the role that policy can play in trying to break in that chicken and egg. We've seen over the last few months some positive policy developments across regions, including in the US, which is where this slide is focusing on. Obviously, there have been lots of conversations about the IRA in the past and what the new Trump administration is going to introduce. We've seen some of the latest One Big Beautiful Act developments over there as well. There is continuous support for the biofuels industry, even though there are some changes within the sustainable aviation fuels credit specifically that can be affecting the scalability of the sector. It's good to see from one side that some of these credits have been indeed renewed for the last few years, for the next few years, sorry. That was one of the key industry asks, but also the price of the, let's say, the tax incentive that SAF molecules can get is going to be reduced over time, and is no longer going to be as high as $175 per gallon like the previous incentive. And this is as a way to try to rebalance the situation between low carbon fuel for road transport and low carbon fuel indeed for aviation. So let's not forget that the two sectors are trying to scale at the same time. There is a big focus on ethanol and feedstocks that are, let's say, alcohol to jet related in the US. And many of these measures are indeed related to agricultural products, but also restrictions of the support to feedstocks coming specifically from North America, US, Mexico, and Canada, as well as some new provisions that are going to exclude the life cycle impact of indirect land use change into the calculations of the incentive. So again, there have been a series of developments which are going to impact significantly the US market, and not just within the SAF space. Obviously, again, when we look into low carbon fuels, we need to think about what is happening beyond aviation, and all of these policy and incentives for markets like green hydrogen or some of these technologies will also have an impact on the scalability of power to liquid from one side, as well as biofuels from the other side. There are also more recent developments in the US that we've seen, in particular with the renewable fuel standards and different ways in which renewable numbers are going to be, identification numbers are going to be calculated going forward. So again, there are lots of policy developments there that can impact the development of biofuels and the low carbon fuel sector, and can try to support industry, but also can then affect the flows of these feedstocks throughout the globe and the flow of products as well. The US market is not the only one we are monitoring. Lots of developments in Asia Pacific. We've already talked about some of the feedstocks. We've already talked about some of the potential in terms of scalability of these production pathways there. These slides recaps a little bit the policy which is developing in the region as a way to really try to scale the SAF market. Starting from some small percentages with some mandates, with some levies that have been introduced or are going to be introduced where policy is still being designed, we then aim to really try to kickstart the market and leverage that industry potential as well. And this Asia Pacific conversation is really important because we're seeing lots of momentum for SAF there, both from indeed a regulatory development, from a supply development, but also from a demand development, which perhaps wasn't necessarily strong over the last few years. And indeed now with a series of commitments, demand is also becoming particularly strong for SAF in the region. We're very keen to capitalize on these, and that's why we launched a new program in Asia Pacific, looking very much into the voluntary demand, complementing the regulatory demand, trying to work with organizations, airlines, and Scope 3 buyers that can indeed scale book and claim as a mechanism to advance sustainable aviation fuels, and then can indeed help scaling the SAF market locally. The idea of this new program is indeed to try to increase awareness of SAF certificates as a mechanism for companies to decarbonize and as a way to really try to unlock some of the SAF markets. So over the next few months, we will conduct a series of workshops, a series of events, really trying to dive deeper into some of the practicalities of SAF certificates and book and claim. What are the current book and claim mechanisms? What are the current ways and business models that companies can take to try to purchase SAF or SAF certificates? Again, whether they are airlines or whether they are indeed corporate buyers. What are the specific feedstock requirements, specifications, and sustainability credentials? Again, building on some of the work that stakeholders have done in this front. And then importantly, looking into the accounting and reporting implications of procuring SAF, which are very important considerations when it comes to the SBTI journey that many companies are trying to go through, as well as the wider sustainability, accounting, and different regulations that apply on this front. Obviously, we've talked about some of the challenges in terms of market prices, some of the technical challenges, some of the more specific, perhaps price concerns as well, the need for offtake agreements. There are many different ways in which these challenges can be tackled and can be addressed. We have put together through one of our latest financing report an overview of different levers that can be pulled all together to try to scale the sustainable aviation fuels market. We have talked about some of the grants in terms of government support, as well as multilateral development banks that can really initiate the different projects. We have already explored in a bit more detail the importance of book and claim that Andreas was talking about just now. I mentioned the long-term offtake agreements as a way to really try to firm up that demand and try to create some price stability within the businesses that can indeed facilitate the flow of private capital and can reduce the cost of capital. But there are also different ways in which that capital can be raised, whether it is through private equity, whether it is through infrastructure and strategic investors, through some form of tolling model system that can reduce the fluctuation of feedstock prices, as well as through different interventions like green bonds or other financial mechanisms. So we try to map a little bit where these could apply in terms of levers, in terms of mechanisms to scale SAF. There is no silver bullet. Probably a combination of all of this together is really essential to scale the sector, but also the strategic application of these levers at different stages of the life cycle production of the SAF and the construction of the facility, as well as different potential applicabilities depending on the technology. Some of them are a bit less relevant for EFA-based products, which are already commercial perhaps. Some of these are a bit more relevant for more advanced SAF production pathways, whether it is indeed alcohol to jet gasification or even power to liquid on that front. This section is a bit more on the infrastructure challenges. So far I've talked about the production side of things. One point that I'd be keen to get across is that production is not the only challenge. So even though SAF can be produced either now or in the future, once those molecules are going to be available, they still need to be delivered to ultimately an aircraft that will use them. And what we're seeing is a few blockers, a few obstacles that companies are facing as they try to move that fuel from the production point to the use point. There are some blending pipeline infrastructure challenges that we have been trying to map with our Airports of Tomorrow community. We've been working with them, and this process is still ongoing to try to really capture where these challenges exist and what could be done to overcome them. But just to mention some of the high-level thoughts that came out of this exercise, there are for sure some segregation requirements and fuel specification requirements when it comes to blending. These may require access to multiple tanks to do and perform that blending. Each tank will need to have a specific type of SAF. You cannot blend necessarily alcohol to jet with power to liquid. You will always need to blend that SAF with the jet fuel first. And do all of the different type of certifications and quality controls over there. There is one important aspect in terms of pipeline access and access to blending infrastructure, which could be perhaps in the hands of some incumbent players in certain markets, and that could prevent the access to either blending or to delivery infrastructure to smaller developers that may have not necessarily had that capability or that access in the past. There are challenges in terms of storage when you look into some of the tankage, finding tankage which is dedicated to SAF specifically. Even when it is dedicated to SAF, it is dedicated predominantly to EFA. And as I mentioned, you cannot put in alcohol to jet or some of these other products. And the size of these tanks don't reflect necessarily the outputs of these SAF production facilities, which tend to be smaller compared to conventional jet fuel. So this is again just an overview throughout that value chain of the airport of some of the challenges that could be faced by stakeholders. And we have an equivalent overview of some of the challenges within the airport environment, where we also expect some degree of infrastructure access control that could prevent indeed the feasibility to supply SAF to a particular airport. There could be regulatory and policy gaps, even though there is perhaps willingness to scale infrastructure within a particular airport. It may not be commercially sensible to bring stuff to that region or to that particular airport if it can be done more cheaply somewhere else. And obviously, there is lots of operational rigidity within the airport environment for safety reasons, for important reasons, but that may prevent some dedicated SAF supply or batches being used directly on particular flights, even though we know that that could be potentially an avenue to perhaps reduce the non-CO2 impact of aviation in the future, trying to perhaps prioritize SAF use on particular flights and particular regions as well. So there are some challenges, but also opportunities there. The final slide on this infrastructure aspect that I want to focus on is a bit of a recap of what we're seeing, in particular on the back of some of these infrastructure challenges that I mentioned. That is generating a variety of business models, different ways in which producers have been approaching the selling and the marketing of the product. Some of these are selling directly to the airline. Some of these are selling to an energy company. Some of them are selling to the airline, but they need to rely on these third-party blenders or storage providers to get that fuel to where they need. And thus they may need to factor in the pricing on that into their offtake agreements with the airlines. But there are indeed some emerging business models which are coming up, which are very important. Obviously, we discussed already book and claim, bringing in Scope 3 buyers into the ecosystem. There are some interesting thoughts that have been raised by some members of our community about potentially involving airports in this as well, even though we know that technically not many airports actually handle the fuel directly. They rely on fuel consortia, they rely on airlines, they rely on big oil and gas players for these. So there were questions on whether this could actually scale. And there are also opportunities to perhaps bring in government into this when we're looking into intermediaries or market-based players that could stabilize again the price of the SAF, take on some of the risk, and ultimately market these to the final end users. So different avenues in which these potential business models can evolve. And again, some work in progress on our side to try to capture the opportunities as well as the risk of these overall. The final slide I've got, trying to keep it to time, is just an overview of some of our upcoming activities. We will be having conversations, as I mentioned, on book and claim, trying to perform that mapping exercise of the different mechanisms, different avenues in which book and claim can be scaled. We are trying to take forward some conversations about allocation of resources across all of the low carbon fuel space. It was already mentioned earlier by some of the colleagues that aviation is competing with shipping, but obviously road transport is still there. Many other sectors will need low carbon fuels, will need hydrogen, and all of these products. What does it mean for those finite resources that could be scaled and that will need to be used for all of this low carbon fuel production? Finally, we will be looking into innovation, how artificial intelligence, for instance, could be applied across the low carbon fuel value chain and what this could mean for aviation decarbonization. And we'll try to also advance the conversation on financing, how we bring the capital to scale sustainable aviation fuels, how we bring the money, the financiers' involvement, with a big conversation on scaling SAF at the Dubai Air Show in November. So these are just some of the opportunities that we are offering to some of our stakeholders that work with us on a regular basis. But if you're interested, do reach out, and yeah, very happy to answer any questions as well. Thank you very much.